Hi, my name is Keith Wayne McCoy, and I am the author of The Travelers, which was published by Champaign Book Group. Publishers Weekly, which is the most prestigious, most elite review journal in America out of New York, called it a philosophically rich hybrid of genres, with rich dialogue and complex plotting, sure to appeal to fans of science fiction and romance. A lot of the events in my book take place aboard the Queen Mary, past and present. This table is from the Queen Mary. Drapery is from the most popular nightclub on the North Atlantic, the Veranda Grill. And the chair I'm sitting in is from the first class dining room, and they're all 80 years old. A synopsis of The Travelers is, in 1947, the luxury liner Queen Mary transmits a message which is intercepted by extraterrestrial intelligence. This errant radio signal serves as a beacon for a North Atlantic encounter between James and Jess Bennett, a GI and his British war bride, and an otherworldly desperate mother and her two small children. The Bennetts left Southampton with only each other, but arrive in New York as a family. In the present day, Guy Turner, a melancholy black filmmaker, finds himself at the center of a supernatural mystery after a haunting prelude with the now elderly mother in a corridor aboard the retired liner in Long Beach, California. Standing at the edge of eternity, the old woman and the Bennetts have the complex task of setting certain aspects of the past in order as the doors to their lives are closing. Guy is thrust into an unexpected and unwanted voyage of self-discovery as he is solely enjoined to bring the three together one last time. The Travelers is a journey to the limits of anxiety, despair, grief, and joy that are common to every human experience of suffering and growth. This is the first edition of this book, and this is the actual painting from the book, and this depicts the scene that I'm going to read, and it's a short excerpt. A magnificent electrical storm split the billowing black skies above Long Beach with supernatural pale violet streaks. For a moment or two, the buildings, streets, and smooth sea were illuminated in uncanny daylight, then plunged appallingly into darkness somehow blacker than the night. The Queen Mary's floodlit stacks fought valiantly to maintain their stark superiority against the antagonistic skies, only to be repeatedly and completely washed in a great scorn of purple-white. Guy had intended to spend only the early afternoon at Queen Mary exploring the archives for that extra minutiae of memorabilia before settling into the editing room. But day turned to night after Mr. Vaughn, the ship's CEO, visited with suggestions. Guy had immersed himself into the documentary since his girlfriend Lynn left, and the great liner quickly became his mistress. There was a moribund loneliness about her that Guy now identified with, an inexplicable sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Her captains were long dead, her passengers non-existent, and she would never again be hastened into a turnabout voyage. She was an enormous monument to the fragility of time, which Guy pondered often. A few days earlier, Guy was on the forecastle when the ship's whistle blew as it did every morning at 10. He and the other day trippers, unfortunate enough to be on deck, hunkered down and covered their ears to the angry roar of a great captured animal in unfamiliar surroundings. "Dear God," someone had said as car alarms sounded in the parking lots in a cacophony of whoops. But the silence that followed was like an explosion to Guy, the startled sound of bare existence. Guy likewise simply existed. He had always known loneliness, but never as such an intimate companion. He was infinitely depressed and imagined that he and the liner somehow shared the same wish, to cease existence, not with a spectacular end, but rather a quiet slip into oblivion. "This is the very suite Winston Churchill stayed en route to the Quebec conference to meet with President Roosevelt," Mr. Vaughn said as he tried unlocking the door. "You know he traveled to North America 3 times on the Queen Mary during the war. not to mention the countless times during peace. Yes, Guy replied in a weary tone. It will be part of the narration. He wanted nothing more than to be at home, sitting in the dark with a cigarette as he did most nights, emptying his mind of everything but the loss of Lynn. But couldn't you at least film the tub where he planned D-Day? Mr. Vaughn asked. He sat in it with toy boats and harbors while his aides surrounded him. How many people do you suppose know that? The lights flickered, and Guy said, Mr. Vaughn, we have over 200 hours of film to edit for a 2-hour documentary. I assure you we have more than enough images to choose from. The little man examined the keys closely and chose another, while Guy waited impatiently. But to actually see the very tub in which that piece of history was planned is quite extraordinary, I promise you. Again the knob would not turn. Mr. Vaughn glanced down the corridor and said, Now surely you got a shot of that never-ending hallway. Yes, we have it. Do you know what shear is? Mr. Vaughn asked as the lights dimmed and brightened. That's the convex curving of the deck, Guy said obligingly. The deck is so long you can't see the end. A hallway over 700 feet long, Mr. Vaughn said, and shook his head in awe. Indeed, the corridor dipped lightly far ahead of them, the paneling glowing warmly from the softly lit fixtures in the ceiling corners, while the lines of handrails on either side led the eye even farther. The cabin doors were like silent regal sentries standing guard over a hallowed pathway that stretched into the past and was measured by years rather than feet. The deck began to rise imperceptibly into the distance, then there was the golden blur of door, panel, and handrail as they melted mysteriously into one, with the final illusion of a pinprick of darkness reaching infinitely upward. When Guy raised a hand to rub his eyes, static electricity jumped from his fingertips to his eyelashes. Mr. Vaughn jerked his hand back when the key shocked him with a blue snap upon contact with the doorknob. For heaven's sake, he said, and Guy watched as he began examining the keys again with infuriating slowness. Guy decided to lie of a previous engagement and make a hasty exit when he heard an unusual sound down the corridor, a soft rippling sound, like water running over rocks in a shallow creek. He turned and a figure appeared distantly, walking toward them through the slashes of golden light given off by the light fixtures. Mr. Vaughn, I really need to run, he said. I'm sorry, but I still have quite a bit to do at the studio tonight. Mr. Vaughn half turned with what Guy assumed would be an appeal to stay, but instead the keys fell to the carpeting with a metallic whimper, and he whispered, Good heavens! Guy followed his gaze, and with pure and absolute astonishment watched as the figure grew clear, an old, long-haired woman, completely naked, approaching with small, tentative steps. Out of the corner of his eye, Guy saw Mr. Vaughn shakily lift a cell phone to his ear. Security to main deck, he said in a low tone. The Churchill suite. She was a deeply lined, dark-skinned woman with feet horribly misshapen by arthritis. Her gray hair swung behind her waist as she walked, her shoulders raised and rounded. Her hips sagged ponderously, more from age than extra weight, and her breasts hung like pears against her chest with dark, olive-colored nipples. The return of Eve after 500 generations. Then she stood before them like a timid deer, her eyes pensive as she looked from one man to the other, perhaps in the hope of detecting compassion. She settled her dark eyes on Guy and moved closer. Her eyes did not reflect the depths of madness or dementia, but rather an incessant plea. She swallowed before speaking, as though choosing her words carefully in fear of misunderstanding. When she opened her mouth, the voice that fell from her lips was deep and strong, though she spoke slowly in a language Guy did not recognize. It sounded faintly Latin, with many L's and T's, and when she finished, she begged him with her eyes. Guy could only return a stare of incomprehension to her, and she brought a hand to her face in anguish. She looked down and mumbled softly to herself, and when he saw that her lids were brimming, he too shared in her frustration. Suddenly, her facial features were resolute, and she met his eyes again with more determination than before. Another approach had obviously occurred to her. Raising her hand without moving her eyes from his, She held before him a plastic name tag, upside down in her fingers, the recessed letters yellow with age. Then, with pronunciation as clear and resonant as the peals of a bell on a cold, crisp morning, she uttered the name on the tag. Bennett. And the effect on Guy was a needling tingle in the small of his back that whirled up his spine to the base of his skull and down again. "I don't understand," Guy said inadequately, in a voice he could hardly hear, but she evidently understood this by his blinking expression and turned to Mr. Vaughn, who could only regard her with his mouth agape. She turned back to Guy. She repeated, even slower but with greater urgency, emphasizing each syllable, "Bennett, Bennett, Bennett." She looked up to him imploringly, but when she obviously recognized the futility of communication, her arm fell limply, even angrily, and she began weeping. The two men were helplessly dumbstruck as she stood before them for a moment, a portrait of despair. Then she turned and began walking back down the corridor, sobbing softly. Though shocked, Guy had no impression of the supernatural. She was a mortal who spoke in a foreign tongue. But time, as he had always known it, stalled when she began her retreat. Halfway down the corridor, her feet did not seem to fall on the carpeting, as though she were walking up an invisible incline that did not match the true rise of the deck. There was the rippling sound again. Then she shimmered like a heat wave rising from pavement, and quite simply disappeared. Now there was no time, just a dislocating sense that he was being pulled into deeper waters of reality than he was ever meant to encounter. An undertow of fear dragged him slowly, his stream of consciousness flowing faster and deeper until he thought he must surely pass out. The utter reality of the experience crashed in waves upon him until there was nothing in his existence but her pathetic eyes holding his. Those dark, helpless, searching eyes that overwhelmed everything, past and present. The empty corridor already haunted him, or rather the memory of her departure from it haunted him, playing over and over in his mind in the eternity of frozen time. Then, far away, he heard his heartbeat beckoning him, louder and louder, marking the seconds of a world changed forever, and time abruptly tumbled into its proper march, with his heart and mind racing wildly to keep up. Mr. Vaughn was collapsing against the door with a dazed, uncomprehending expression when Guy returned to the present. The bewildered man reached for Guy's arm as he sank and brought a hand to his chest and began gasping for breath. Two security guards rounded a corner from the opposite end of the corridor and broke into a run with guns drawn when they saw Guy standing over the fallen man. "He's having a heart attack," Guy said irritably, and some semblance of normality returned. As one, the other called for an ambulance. Ozone hung heavily in the air. It required his greatest act of courage to look back down the corridor. It was quiet and undisturbed, as though years had passed since those bare feet had padded down the carpeting, and, for a moment, he wondered if it had really happened. He noticed something on the carpeting where she had stood before them, and when he squatted to retrieve it, his knees trembled so violently that he had to balance himself with a hand on the wall. He stood and looked down at the name tag in his palm, contemplating his own newly found Rosetta Stone and the long journey he was about to embark upon. The Travelers is available as an ebook or print edition on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And if you would wish to know more about my collection of Queen Mary memorabilia, please visit www.keithwaynemccoy.com. And I thank you for listening.